And hopefully they're all right. We're live, it says. Excellent. And I still do not see a record button. Anyone who watches this, can you tell me how to record on StreamYard? I'm supposed to be able to record this, but it's not allowing me to. So if anyone can put that in the comments and let me know before we end, that would be great. I'm Stephanie Erickson. I'm the author of the book Plan for Aging Well and a caregiving expert and a clinical social worker. Today, though, we're not talking about fun, happy things, which actually social workers don't do often talk about fun, happy things. We tend to be in the thick of the problems. And today we're going to be talking about grief in the context of caregiving. I mean, a lot of us are experiencing grief anyway, and loss with the pandemic. And for me, what I want to really talk about today is that grief is not just death. And I think that's what people associate is grieving. I'm grieving because somebody died, but it's not just that. We experience losses all the time throughout our life, starting from little tiny kids when our parents take this pacifier away from us. That's a loss, right? So right away from an early age, we begin to experience loss and develop coping skills and watch our families around us and how they cope with loss. And that kind of builds our reserves or not, and how we cope with losses throughout our life. But caregivers have a very unique experience of loss because it's not just about your everyday losses. They're typically in a situation where someone has some type of loss of autonomy, and perhaps they're even dying or they're have a neurocognitive disorder like dementia. And so then there's those losses. And so it's kind of like this repeated theme within their life of losses. And so I brought here Dr. Eboni Green, and she is an expert in caregiving. I'll tell you just a brief bit about her. She's actually a nurse, an RN, but she also has her PhD in healthcare administration. And she also teaches a nursing assistant course. And that's what's so exciting about having her on, is because she's been with patients directly, but she's also looked at this from a bird's eye view academically. So she has both of those perspectives, which I really appreciate. And I'm so glad you're here, Eboni. She's also a professor at Purdue University, and she's a co-founder of the Caregiver Support Services. And we'll talk about what you do at the end. Thanks, Eboni, for coming on.
Thank you, Stephanie. That introduction made me sound really accomplished.
I know. Sometimes when people introduce me, I'm like, wow, I sound like I got it together. But if you really knew me, you'd realize I'm a mess like everybody else.
Right.
So anyways, thanks for being here, Eboni. So let's first talk about, I kind of explain what grief and loss is to me. What does it mean to you? I know that this is the field that you're in, but how do you define grief and loss? Are they different? Are they the same?
Well, when I think about grief and loss, I feel like they have overlapping themes. As you mentioned, we're often experiencing variations of loss from the time that we are born until we pass away, and so there's a constant ebb and flow of um, of thank
Wanted
you.
to show you a comment. Okay. Sorry, took you off track, but I wanted you to see. Thank you, Zofia, I guess is your name. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just think that there's a constant ebb and flow of loss. And the grieving process or grieving experience, I think, is a little bit, we've put ourselves into a little bit of a pressure cooker with regard to grieving, and feel like we should have these 5 stages, which when I was really looking at grief from an academic perspective, we often use Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief.
Yeah.
And I even took a graduate course about grief, and reread some of her books and such, and realized that much of what she talks about is the grieving individual who is passing away. And so when we talk about the 5 stages of grief, yes, it can be applied to those of us who are living, but we often put the pressure on ourselves that we're going to go through these 5 stages of grief, and then at the end of a year or so, we're going to get back to normal. Well, recently, when my mother-in-law passed away, we cared for her, and I've had a lot of, I've actually sat down and done a grief loss timeline. And it was really helpful for me because I was able to then look at why during this holiday season am I starting to feel more sad, even when I'm happy. I love the holidays. And sometimes it's the reminder aspect of things. But for me, this is the time frame between now and about the end of January where I've had a lot of family loss, meaning people that I really love and have cared for have
Yeah.
passed away. So I say all that to say that we put that pressure on ourselves that we're going to go through these 5 stages of grief, and then we're going to suddenly feel okay. When my mother-in-law passed away, I didn't even process her passing until after a year.
Let me stop you on that topic for a second, Ebony, because you're talking about a lot of stuff. But I, first of all, I really appreciate what you're saying, that we put things in boxes as if we're supposed to be feeling a certain way for a certain amount of time. And then that's what leads people to say things like, oh, you'll feel better in 6 months. And then you get to 6 months, you're like, I still feel like hell. I thought I was supposed to feel better. And grief and a lot of emotions are not like that. They're not linear, right? We bounce all over the place. But when you were talking about it being, associated with death, let's talk about it related to caregiving and the grief about when we're caring for someone, but they're still alive. And I
Mhm.
think that we get so caught up as caregivers in the tasks that we don't have the space to grieve. So, like you were saying with your mother in law, like you didn't even have time to process it. And I think that's part of the challenge for caregivers is that they need to be grieving ongoing
Mhm.
about what the changes are, but they're so caught up in the day to day that they don't even have the space for it. What would you say to that? I'm going to look at the comments. I'm putting my glasses on. I'm going to look, but answer, please.
Yes, well, I feel like oftentimes there isn't that opportunity because if you're going through changes in your loved one's condition, then you're processing the change and what you need to immediately do to adapt to the change in condition. And so I'll just bring this up. A lot of times, what individuals will end up feeling is more of a post traumatic response after a long period of time. And what we see often is like physical symptoms. I'm not sleeping. I'm breaking out in hives. I'm really nervous at work. And if you don't feel like you have, if you're working in caregiving and you don't feel like you have a supportive system there, then you may end up leaving your job, and you're still, now you've got to worry about the finances. And so it just kind of compiles. And so, the healthy way would be to, for us as professionals, to at least have the acknowledgement that this is what a lot of individuals are experiencing, and then to, like we say in caregiving, often we say take care, but then to also give people permission to express how they're feeling as they are providing care, just like the mantra, take care. Okay, let's revisit, how are you feeling, and give people the space to actually answer that with regard to the loss and the grief.
I like how you're saying give people the space because people everyone is so afraid of that hard feelings that we all run away from them. I mean, we definitely have a death phobic society. No one wants to talk about that, which is kind of led to people not putting wishes in writing and planning their passing and having celebrations and all these other things because we're so afraid of dying. And I think we're also just so afraid of feeling that loss or feeling the pain when we're caring for somebody. And so we don't ask the questions. We don't give the space. We say things with very good intentions like everything's going to be fine.
Mhm.
But maybe for that person, everything's not going to be fine. So it's really about opening up that space. And how do caregivers, if they're, in the trenches day to day, how can we as professionals help them to open up the space, express what they're feeling, like you're saying in the moment, that ongoing all the ongoing losses they're experiencing, but then be able to tie it back up in a way to help them function, because it's like if you let out too much, you'll fall apart and then not be able to care for the person that you need. And I think that's why caregivers maybe don't want to express, because they're
Mhm.
like, if I pop this balloon, it's going to be a mess. How do we as professionals help to support somebody, kind of like just leak the air a bit in a balloon to allow to relieve some of the pressure?
Well, I think that's really a challenging one of the more challenging aspects of what we do is being able to ensure that people have healthy ways. And I do feel like individual healthy ways to express their sadness and their feelings of being overwhelmed. And I do think that it can be really challenging to get someone to go ahead and associate their feelings with actually reaching out for help. I mean, even with this advocacy that we're all doing with aging and caregiving, and like I said, the mantra of that we really mean to take care of yourself, breaking that um, into something that is going to actually servable steps or tips, so someone doesn't have to try to think about what it is that they need to do. Um, in order to take care of themselves. So, the other consideration that I have with grief is that you do have to, caregivers do have to be at a servable moment. So
What do you
that,
mean by that servable moment?
I mean that when you're providing care and you're really distressed, I can give you tips on what it is that has worked for me. But unless you're at a point where you can actually process that, you're actually at a point where you're overwhelmed enough, or you feel like you will be able to accept the help that someone is offering you, then you're not necessarily at that servable moment where you're going to take the action. And I will just share with you my personal experience when with my mother-in-law passing. We had had a series of caregiving situations, and my mom lives in California. And so we've been here a little over 20 years. And so you don't always acknowledge or recognize how important someone is, at least I didn't, in your daily life. And
Mm.
like when my mother-in-law passed away, um, it was took time for me to recognize she was there every day for 20 years. So she's down the street, those little quick calls where she needs a little something. And then the last few years, of course, we're caring for her, and she was living with our great grandmother who is down the street as well. And I had all kinds of things going on. And it took time for me to recognize about a year later that I am so overwhelmed because I haven't processed the fact that it was okay for my mom to be at a distance in another, she visits and such, but I had a mom here
Mm.
every day. And so my kids would have thought that my husband and I have been so strong. Like, I don't know how you and our son, he was really distraught maybe about 6 to 8 months ago. And he's like, I don't know how you and dad are so strong, and you took care of grandma. And I'm not the same after she's passed away. And we had a real heart to heart. I'm not the same after she passed away either. And no, I'm not strong. Me and dad talk and cry about grandma all the time. And I had to get to a servable moment where I was overwhelmed enough to go ahead and reach out and go see a counselor.
There's so much in there, Ebony, that I kept thinking of things I wanted to say, but I didn't want to interrupt your flow. But the servable moment, I love that phrase. I'm going to use it, and I'll always reference you when I use it. But that is amazing. It's basically the openness to be ready to hear the feedback. And I think that's something I learned being a parent of teenagers is when I say to my kids, do you want me to talk to you about this right now? Are you in the space or not? And a lot of times they say no. And in my mind, I was ready to deliver whatever, whatever sermon I was probably, that's probably what it feels like to them that I was about to deliver. But the thing that you just talked about at the end with your son, that is so beautiful, because this is part of what I think goes wrong for people as we grow up. I talked about that in my intro, is that we're given messages about grief and loss by watching our significant others, our close family around us process. And so we have to be real. We have to be telling them what's going on and be authentic, that no, just because, a year has gone by, I'm still not okay. I'm still discovering the ways that this loss is impacting me. And I love that you had that conversation with your son, because now he is going to grow up into a secure man who understands that he can express his grief, he can share it with his family, that it is an ongoing process that evolves. It's beautiful. I really love to hear that. And before you give me some feedback on that, let me just tell you some of the things that people are saying. Someone from Nairobi, Kenya, said, "Great topic. Grief is not a boxing process." I love that.
Mhm.
Penny, she's said a few things. I'm going to put her comment up. Grief is different for everyone. Acceptance and forgiveness are paramount to the healing process. Penny also said, Caregiver Mantra Meditations is a useful ebook. So I wanted to throw that up there. And anyway, and Life, oh, this is Michelle said, good morning from Life is a Sacred Journey, which is a great podcast if anyone's interested in talking about caregiving. Michelle does that podcast. It's really nice. So anyways, what is your response to that in terms of like the family lessons that we can impart and help to shape our own coping mechanisms as we grow up with grief and loss?
Well, I think that there's some great things that were shared in the comments about how grief is different, and that the forgiveness part I think is important, and I think it's important to recognize that we have to forgive ourselves too.
Mhm.
That sometimes the relationship between you and even when you've been a caregiver, sometimes for your loved one, sometimes the relationship is different, and so you're going to feel different when that person passes away. So in my professional life, I have been there in the room with someone who's passed away. I've gone to the memorial services or funeral services for the organization that I was working at, and I always felt good about that, especially when you would. I was working in long term care, so you didn't always see the family. And you go to the memorial service or the funeral service, and you see all these people that this person's life impacted. So I always felt that that was meaningful. But when you're talking about your differences, so I was able to deal with that in a those types of situations often very positively. When you're talking about family members, friends, people that you've cared for, I think it just really is different depending on the relationship. And so
Yes.
sometimes you feel perfectly fine. Um, you're sad, but your level of coping is different. Your ability to cope is different. So my when my aunt passed away, um, we're birthday twins almost, because my birthday's on the 5th of January and hers is on the 4th of January. And so we're both Capricorns, and my mom always would talk about that. And so she was my favorite aunt, and she did have schizophrenia. And when she passed away, it was hard to process, but I didn't see her every day like I did for with my mother-in-law. My husband also took care of his biological dad and his stepdad, and so we cared for them like 2 years back to back. We're the primary folks taking care of their needs. Losing my husband's biological dad, we were had a good relationship, but it was different than again than losing my aunt or my mother-in-law. So I think your coping can be different. And then I also think that
Before you go
oh, go
off
ahead.
on that, let me just talk about, because I want to hit on those relationship pieces before you take it to another theme. I think for caregivers, if just to going back to not about loss associated with death, but the loss that you experience ongoing in the caregiving relationships and what those dynamics are essential and create all different kinds of layers of loss. Because just because you're a caregiver, someone doesn't for somebody doesn't mean you actually like them. You
Mhm,
might have a whole history behind. So you might be caring for your father, but grieving the process that he was never the dad you wanted him to be. And now, on top of that, you're grieving watching him deteriorate his health, knowing that he's going to die, perhaps, or grieving that you don't have the relationship with your kids because now you're taking care of him and you're resentful and angry. And so, there's
mhm.
all of these relationship dynamics that absolutely impact the way we grieve after somebody dies, and certainly as we're experiencing loss and going through the grieving process as somebody's alive, even.
Yeah, and I think that that's, when I look at my husband and his biological dad, he who, like I said, was they had a beautiful relationship, but it all seems to all he's a leader, my husband. And so it always seems to fall on him for those intricate moments. And so I don't know how he's still functioning, but he was there just in those final moments to hold his dad's hand when he passed away. But as far as, we'd asked him to move to, he was in Aberdeen, South Dakota. We'd asked him to move to Nebraska years before because, if you're going to need assistance, everybody's here. And then the relationships with his siblings, the relationship with their dad, the other siblings is not as strong. So even though they had a good relationship, it was complicated. And then he wasn't necessarily the one that was there for him day in and day out, but my husband Terrence was the one that was there for his dad. So when you're talking about those complex feelings, the person that ends up being there in the end might not be the person you invested the time and resources into when they were younger.
Absolutely. And it makes it so difficult then after someone passes too to process that. I know that after my dad died, and he had basically when I was about 5 left, and I didn't really have much of a relationship with him until I was in my mid teens, maybe 14, 15. He kind of started coming around, but it wasn't until I was really in like my late 20s that our relationship really solidified. And then it got stronger and stronger and stronger. And then he died one day of a sudden heart attack. So it was like, but it was like two losses. I was reliving the loss of when I was a little kid and he left, and those loss, and then finally had him back. Now I'm losing him again. And I think that's why, and not to put down the 5 stages of grief, but I don't think it gives it justice to how
Mm-mm.
complicated loss is for people of because of all of these factors. And then you have the influence of everybody else around you telling you how you should be grieving or not understanding how you should be grieving. And just like living is a very individualized experience, grief is too, right? We're
Mhm.
all very different. Your husband responds to grief very differently than you do. And you look at him like, wow, how could he be doing this? And he looks at you like, well, how come you're doing this? Like it's very different for people. I didn't really want to go more than 25 minutes. So let me, because I want to give you a chance to talk about what your books, because you've written 3 books, and you also are the co-founder of the Caregiver Support Services. So first, talk to me about the books and then the support services.
Well, it kind of ties into the last thing that you mentioned with my husband being really strong. I remember right after his dad passed that that he got into kind of a, I don't know, where he, was wearing the same things and all that kind of stuff for a little while. And he is like the person that does all the reading and everything when I'm writing something. So for the grief book, Reflections from the Soul, I decided I would wait and have him read the whole thing when it was done and had gone through the first edit. And so it was after he'd lost his dad and his stepfather. And he was really deeply touched. And he was like, I think that I've have complicated
Mhm.
grief. And so I just thought that that really brought him around to talk about it. And I'm
Nice.
like, so that was helpful. So Reflections from the Soul is the most recent book, and that's about grieving. And I use a lot of personal experiences, but also historical folks who maybe went through really challenging experiences. There's some great stories in there. At the heart of the matter is if you're maybe a caregiver who's just in the general caregiving realm, you've been caregiving for a little while, and now you just need some spiritual inspiration, some quotes and tips, and poems are included in that.
Nice.
And then Caregiving in the New Millennium is the I just need to get organized, and where do I find and locate resources? And then Caregiver Support Services, we have been around for little over 20 years now. We started as the Senior Caregiver Support Group, and we provide training and support for family and frontline caregivers.
Amazing. Amazing. Let me finish off with a question that Penny put up there. Well, there's two questions. One was how does a normal, okay, because I don't know that English is the first language of this person. What does normal grief usually look like? But I think we've covered that. There is no normal grief. Whatever you're experiencing, to me, it would be if a change in functioning. So
Mhm.
that's the time when it's not normal anymore. If you're crying, you can't get out of bed, and you're really sad, that is normal to happen
Yeah.
after somebody passes. It's if that goes on for a longer period of time and then
Mhm.
begins to interfere with your functioning, then
Yes.
that's not normal, and then you want to seek help. So I just want to answer that quickly. Oh, and someone sent, I'm just going to put this up. This is really nice. From all of us at Global Women for Wellbeing, thank you for this conversation. Thank you very
Oh,
much. That's
yes.
really nice. And Penny had a question. Maybe you can just answer it. Who can we best assist? Who can we best assist caregivers who can't oh, maybe it's how. How can we best assist caregivers who can't let go of the guilt while grieving? Oh my God, that's really hard, that guilt. Do you have
Yes.
any magic wand advice for, for Penny?
I I don't have. I think it's a daily. The struggle is real,
Yeah,
and it is a daily thing, and that could be a whole nother chat about how to work
you're
through
right.
your guilt. But if you really feel like it's like grief, if it's starting to impact your daily life, I am all for going and seeing a therapist, a counselor, working through it that way. And I've done it, and it's been wonderful for me.
Yeah, and after I lost my father and I was struggling, that was not the only thing that got me into therapy, which I've done several times in my life, but it was definitely something that we addressed throughout. So, but that's another topic. Maybe we can do that another time, Ebony, talk
Mhm.
about grief, guilt and grief. There we go.
Yeah,
There's a topic, guilt and grief. We'll throw that up there another time. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. Where can people reach you? Where can people buy your book? My book's available on Amazon, Plan for Aging Well. Your book?
beautiful, and congratulations on your
Thank
book.
you. And your books, are they
Um,
on Amazon as well?
they're on Amazon, and we're at caregiversupportservices.org or .com.
Great.
Caregiversupportservices.org or .com.
And in this thread, if you have a question or you want to have a direct connection to you, Ebony, can I pass on? Well, I could just give the link to your website, I suppose, and I know
Mhm.
your books and stuff are up there. So if in the thread you want to send me a direct message or just put it up there, I'll put it up your contact information as well. Thanks a lot, Ebony. Really appreciate it. Stay safe. Wear your mask,
Thank you so much.
and we'll talk again another time. Thanks, Ebony.
Thank you.